Hello, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate lecture in our history together since 1500. We are well into the 20th century, and we're going to talk about two of the big movements that are happening in the middle of the 20th century, and that is the Cold War and decolonization. Now, before we get too far started, let's go ahead and do a little bit of review. In the 1940s, Europe is devastated and the world is struggling. And what would the United States like to see in Europe? You can refer back to your notes from last week, or hopefully you know it right off the top of your head, because it's a rebuilt trading and security partner. Europe would be integrated, sort of, in the American financial institution that's being restructured. We cannot overstate how profound the destruction of World War II was for the world economy, as well as Europe, Asia, and many parts of Africa. This necessitated a restructuring of the economic order. No longer will we have these kind of spheres of influence, competing ideas between colonial powers. Instead, it would be a one world, one kind of system. What would the Soviet Union like to see in Europe? Well, if you refer back to your notes, if you think off the top of your head, that is essentially the opposite of what the United States wants, you would be correct. A weak, easily influenced Europe is in the Soviet Union's interest. Why? Well, there's a little bit of historical parallels there. There are some previous engagements with a unified Europe that may have frightened Russia. In the 19th century, it was Napoleon. In the 20th century, it was Hitler. So it seems like it's just a matter of time before a unified Europe decides that it's going to invade Russia again. And so the Soviet Union's very eager to have that cut off. Also, it helps if the world is impoverished to sow division, sow unrest, and to export the revolution. So do these visions foresee the same world? Well, obviously not. Now let's move on, and we're going to talk about some terms. The first term we're going to talk about is the Cold War. The Cold War is called so because the United States and the Soviet Union never got into a real direct war. That's not for lack of trying. The US and the Soviet Union really did come very, very close in a period of time that your parents or grandparents might have been around, and that would have been amazingly disastrous. But in essence, the Cold War boils down to a struggle of ideas about the economy, about rhetoric, about governance, and also kind of a military rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. These two so-called superpowers had different visions for the world in general, of course, with them at the head. The United States at the head of one particular vision, the Soviet Union at the head of a different particular vision, kind of a unified world with similar goals. Does this really play out? Is it a perfect vision? No, it kind of ignores a lot of uh, local interests, a lot of cultural differences, and even when we talk about, like, say, the Soviet and its satellite states or the United States and its allies, we're not talking about a true monolith. There are competing visions within each of those movements. So we've got the Cold War nailed down. Anti-colonialism is the 20th century equivalent to all of those scramble for Africa and snatching up territories in Asia. It is the counterpoint, if you will. It's a movement that either seeks to overthrow colonial, usually European powers, and institute a independent rule by local people, the way it was before, say, the 19th century or the 18th century. Or sometimes it's an invitation for colonial powers to just please leave, thank you very much, have a nice day. Now, it isn't always the same. Sometimes you have violence that's associated with it. Sometimes you have keeps relative nonviolence that's associated with it. We'll get into a couple of case studies later on. But anti-colonialism also is a readjustment or a reassessment of internal policies in many countries that seek to divide and rule. As I've mentioned many times before, divide and rule was a very useful tactic for colonial powers to keep themselves in power in foreign countries, but it was also used domestically in Europe, in North America, in Australia, in Africa, and other places as well, to keep the populace divided, at each other's throats, emotionally charged, and thus it's easier to rule. One would think an easier to rule country would be one that has a unified goal and a unified vision and a unified love for each other, but others who would deem themselves real politicians or real politique would disagree. Now, finally, let's move on to neoliberalism. Now, we've talked about liberalism and we've talked about conservatism. Neoliberalism adopts many of the uh, tenets of a conservatist movement that is a laissez-faire kind of approach to government and the economy. And the idea behind neoliberalism is that as economic barriers between countries are lowered, as countries become more enmeshed, this would create a social change around the world. And that social change would follow the movement of money. So, for example, if you can take country A and lower its tariffs and modernize its economy and expand its middle class, and that middle class will make demands upon its ruling government, and that'll expand the rights and the privileges and the happiness of the said country A, that is always good. That's the idea behind it. And the core principle for neoliberalism is the movement of money, or what we call the liquidity of capital. The liquidity of capital, the ability to shift funds from one country to another, is vital for neoliberalist policies. It's vital for this kind of super globalization. It allows for companies to, say, have manufacturing in country A, have assembly in country B, sell products in countries C, D, E, and F, that sort of thing. The idea is that as corporations chase the cheaper labor, the cheaper sources of resources, the more profitable the company becomes, and then countries like C, D, E, and F transition to less of a manufacturing company, a manufacturing based economy, and more into a service or information based economy. There are many, 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 many critiques of this neoliberalist model, particularly that it kind of overlooks a lot of the social problems that are created by this race to the bottom, for lack of a better term, for labor costs. For example, it will never happen in the United States that we will be able to compete with labor from Bangladesh or from China or from India in terms of pure dollars spent. Just the dollars per hour that they spend on labor in those countries is so infinitesimally smaller that it would absolutely ruin the United States. Good example, Bangladeshi garment workers earn maybe 50 cents an hour. 50 cents an hour, working 10-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. That's not going to happen without a radical change in the United States. So what do? Well, the idea is that the neoliberalist models would be like, oh, well, we're selling lots of products in the United States from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is getting 50 cents an hour, where before they were getting 40 cents or 20 cents or 10 cents or maybe $1 a day, something like that. And the United States is selling these products. Well, they work for retailers, they work for advertising firms, they work for marketing firms or whatever like that, and they earn better money than they would if they were actually weaving the garments. So they can afford to do this. As we see with the coronavirus continuing to disrupt trade networks. That's an imperfect solution. It is a very flawed solution that ignores the fact that what if this trade network breaks down? What if products can't be taken from country A and brought to country B? What happens if your source of cotton, your source of elastic, your source of plastic or whatever are disrupted and you can't get those when you need them for your country? So that is a quick breakdown of neoliberalism and a minor critique of it. So the Cold War didn't just happen. It had to be created. During World War II, the Soviet Union and the Allies, that being the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, uh, had worked together and coordinated in the war effort against Germany, and it was a much needed coordination. Although the United States had a massive productive capacity, although the Soviet Union had an incredible population capacity, the German offensive, the German planners, the German technology was just so much better than its opponents that there really needed to be a coordination. Now, the United States, after the Second World War, shifts gears and goes from defeating fascism to containing communism, preventing communism from spreading into other states. And the idea is to replace this appeal of a controlled, directed economy with neoliberalist economy, that things produced in the United States would be purchased in Europe. Those things purchased in Europe would be used to rebuild Europe. Europe would become much more service oriented, information oriented, would be much more of a steady consumer, and thus would be more tied into the global market. Ostensibly, the United States becomes a leader of the so-called developed world, or what sometimes is referred to as the first world. Western and Central Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, that sort of thing. The Soviet Union, on the other side, saw the alliances that were that saw the formation of alliances that were aimed at exporting a economic, rhetorical, political revolution. And countering the exploitation of neoliberalism was a planned economy, one that would ensure justice or the even sharing of burdens amongst all. Now, this communism is a very state-directed economy. It would prevent people from being exploited too much, at least in theory. It would prevent people from gaining too much and being able to overwhelm the system with their power, with their influence, that sort of thing. And ostensibly, they were the leader of the now developing world, the world that had been left behind or had been ravaged by 19th century and early 20th century colonialism. Places like Eastern Europe, China, Southeast Asia. You see it exporting to Africa and Latin America, that sort of thing. Now, there's some highlights in the Cold War that actually showed that the Cold War could have very quickly become a hot war. We're going to look into a few of these. The first one, of course, is the Berlin airlift, which happens almost immediately after the end of the Second World War and really pushes both the Soviet Union and the United States into this antagonistic relationship. We're then going to press on and talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days in October 1962, when all life as we know it on the earth would have ceased to exist. Full stop. There is no if, ands, or but. There is no, well, we could have lived in underground. No, no, you could not have. Absolutely could not have. And we came extremely close. It wasn't revealed until 2002 just how truly close the United States and the Soviet Union came to wiping out all life. And I mean all life on planet Earth, period. It might have started coming back in a couple hundred years from now, but who knows what kind of life it would have been. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War as a potential conflict, potential uh, hot war between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies. The Vietnam War and its cousin, the Afghan War in 1978, are what we call proxy wars, where one side or the other is defeated by forces that are propped up, financed, and provided for by the opposite side. So in the case of the Vietnam War, the United States and its allies, as well as the South Vietnamese government, were fighting against the North Vietnamese government, theoretically. But the North Vietnamese government was funded and supplied by the Soviet Union and China. Uh, Afghan War, same thing is happening, just opposite. The tables are turned. So the Soviet Union is fighting against a scattered Afghan resistance that is increasingly funded by the United States and its allies. Both wind up with the major power being defeated because asymmetrical wars have a tendency to grind down the infrastructure. They are not guaranteed to win. Asymmetrical wars are not, but they do have a good chance of defeating, especially in the long run. You have to be very patient with these asymmetrical wars. The Vietnam War takes almost 30 years to resolve between the beginning of the first Vietnamese independence war and the eventual leaving of American troops. Afghan War takes about a little bit over 12 years, something like that. No, just shy of 12 years, I believe. So that takes a while to be patient. And as we see with the Afghan War now, we've been there since 2001. It's now 2020. So 19 years, we're still there. How much longer are we going to be? I don't know. So at the end of World War II, the country of Germany is divided into eastern and western portions. Well, initially it's actually divided into four different parts. Uh, in the south, we have the American quadrant. In the middle, we have the United Kingdom's quadrant, and in the north, we have the French quadrant. Uh, in the far east, we have the Soviet Union quadrant. So we've got four pieces of Germany that are administered, at least in theory, by each of these allies. Later on, the USA, UK, and French influence become melded into one unified territory known as the German Republic, or the Bundesrepublik Deutschland. So it's the a democratic Western Germany. The Eastern German becomes the Deutsche Democratic Republic, or the DDR, and it's very communist. The same is happening in Berlin itself. Berlin, the capital, is divided in a very similar manner, with three quadrants in the west and one quadrant in the east, controlled respectively by the Allies in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. Now, according to this agreement, Berlin becomes a special kind of almost international city uh, by agreement. Why? Well, Berlin is in the eastern part of Germany. The Soviet Union actually makes it into Germany and conquers many parts of Germany very early on, and it's an agreement between the Soviet Union and the Allies that the symbolic importance of Berlin cannot be overstated, and so the city would be divided in a manner not dissimilar to the way the country would be divided. And in order to be able to get to that city, there would be this corridor, this free flow of goods and people back and forth between West Berlin and West Germany. So if you were lucky enough to live in West Berlin in 1946, let's say 1947, you could theoretically go to Western Germany. Most people did not. But you could at least in theory go. This is more important for getting food, fuel, medicine, and personnel back and forth between Western Europe and into Western Berlin. Now, the Allies during the war came up with this idea because, at least to the mindset of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Stalin could be worked with. Yes, he was a dictator. Absolutely. He was a brutal individual. Absolutely. But there was still room to work with. Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt that he could be coerced, could be brought very eventually into the fold. With the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the trust erodes almost immediately, evaporates seemingly overnight. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, Harry Truman, doesn't trust Stalin, sees Stalin as a bully, which he was, sees him as a madman, which he was, sees him as untrustworthy, which in reality he kind of was. Same with Churchill. Churchill had never understood the alliance with the Soviet Union, but needs must. He once quipped that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least spare a kind word for the devil. So that's how the opinion that Churchill had for Stalin. So this mistrust begins to build a rift between the Soviet Union and the United States. So in 1947, things are starting to get a little tenuous and they begin to break apart. There's an initial restriction that the Soviet Union puts on personnel, especially military personnel, visiting Western Berlin. And this begins, it's kind of a precursor to what would be known as the Berlin Airlift in 1948. Now, to the Soviet view, the core issue was the issuance of a unified German or a new German currency in the West. This Deutschmark, which was created by the Allies, was intended to replace the default Reichsmark or the Empire mark. The reason why the Western countries wanted to replace the Reichsmark is because the Reichsmark was devalued. There were literally hundreds of thousands of uh, bills being circulated every single day. There were just way too many. It was so bad that the Germans began to use cigarettes and chocolate as actual bartering mediums in lieu of money because the money was basically useless. So they introduced this new Deutschmark in order to prop up the West German economy, to make it more integral to the Western countries' economies. And they began to introduce this Deutschmark into Western Berlin. Well, this upsets the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, unbeknownst, well, probably known to the Western powers intelligence community, the Soviet Union had found a bunch of printing presses for the Reichsmark and was purposefully devaluing and hyperinflating the Deutschmark, or the Reichsmark rather. And so this introduction of the Deutschmark is a new stable uh, uh, currency, and that hinders the Soviet Union's aims. So they flex their international muscles. They cut off access to Berlin, and the thinking is the United States is too far away. The United Kingdom is way too weak and depleted, as is France too weak and depleted to really oppose the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union could basically strong arm the Western countries into dropping this idea of a unified unified West Germany with a strong currency. For the Allied view, the logistical agreement, or I'm sorry, the logistical infrastructure was still there from World War II. So there were still a lot of policies and procedures in place. And it's a logical extension to the Allies that if we're going to rebuild Europe and we're going to rebuild Germany, Germany needs to have a stable economy. Germany needs to have a stable currency. So it just makes sense. And since West Berlin is part of West Germany, even though it's located in the East, it should also be receiving the stable currency. So this logistical infrastructure was really, which had begun to be dismantled, was really ramped up, and it was dialed in and became a very efficient machine. It was a very important time for the United States because the United States is talking about rebuilding Europe. This is the beginning of the Marshall Plan. This is the beginning of the rebuilding of Europe. We're bringing Europe out of the brink of possible revolution. So the United States needs to step up and show leadership. And what does the United States transport to West Berlin? Well, necessities, things like food, fuel, medicine, clothing, all sorts of things are all taken to West Berlin. So this is not a military operation. So there's no bombs, there's no troops, there's no bullets, nothing like that. It's all humanitarian relief. Now, this humanitarian relief lasts for about 9 months. Um, Initially, the United States really thought that the Soviet Union would oppose the airlift and that they would try to intercept the uh, the freighters that are, or the airplanes, the cargo planes that are flying over to Berlin. The Soviet Union, their gambit really didn't pay off. They could have absolutely shot down those freighter planes or those cargo planes, but the reality is, if they had, that would have definitely sparked a war with Europe, with the United States. The United States absolutely would have responded. And at the time, in 1948, the United States has a monopoly on atomic weaponry. And the use of that atomic weaponry was probably very much on the table. So the Soviet Union really didn't, other than pestering and trying to interfere with the flight paths of these cargo planes, really didn't have a coordinated response. The airlift starts off with shipping about 3,700 tons of food, fuel, medicine, clothing, you name it, baby formula, whatever, every day. By the end of it, they're shipping over 12,900 pounds, 12,900 tons every day. Uh, and you can see this gaggle of young German boys standing on the rubble of the devastated Western Berlin. That Berlin wasn't even close to being back on its feet yet. It was barely starting to be rebuilt, and so these relief efforts were very much needed. Most of the deaths that happen in the Berlin airlift are because of accidents, or because people didn't get medicine in time, or because they didn't get enough food before uh, it, uh, the relief effort could really ramp up. So people died of malnutrition or starvation. Some people died of exposure. Some people died because they were diabetic and didn't get insulin, or they needed drugs to, counteract their heart disease or whatever like that. They weren't able to get those. That's the majority of the deaths. It actually was an incredible PR boom for the United States, and it really cast the Soviet Union as the international bad guy, especially because during these approaches, as you can see, there's a wing of an airplane on the approach there. One particular pilot saw these children watching the planes coming in with the relief, knowing that they were bringing in food and stuff, and he thought it would be a neat trick for him to drop little parachutes with chocolate and with little treats on there for the kids. And on his approach, he would wiggle the wings a little bit back and forth, so they would know that to be ready for this. And so more and more children used to come and gather at the end of the runways, and he became known as Captain Waggle Wings in the German media. And this was this incredible outpouring of humanitarian aid, and this showing the compassion of Americans, showing the humanitarian side of the American mission versus the Soviet side, which was very brutal and very harsh. So it really set the Soviet PR campaign back quite a bit. This Berlin airlift. So you're thinking, so what, right? What's the big deal? Well, to the Soviet Union was unable to contend with the United States. They didn't have the military capacity, although they were fairly close. There was a lot more planes, tanks, and people on the ground for the Soviet Union than there was the Americans, but the Americans had the advantage in logistics, alliances, and technology at the time, because a lot of the technology that had been kind of pilfered from the Japanese and the Germans had really worked its way into American technology. The Allies' intentions were this idea of an interwoven economy and cooperative politics. They seem to have been prepared for something like this happening. probably not what was happening, but to the Soviet Union, this preparation seemed to be a proof that the Western Europeans were not just integrating to rebuild, they were integrating to invade. Now, to the United States could no longer return to an isolationist policy. There really, really was a push to return to isolationism. This idea of, well, now that the world's been saved, we can go back to sleep. We don't have to worry about the outside world. Why are we spending money? Well, this proves the United States cannot take a back seat. The United States is, for lack of a better term, in charge, and that is partly because of the blessing of having been in North America and being spared the majority of the devastation, and also because the United States really, I mean, who else is going to counter the Soviet Union? If the United States had gone back into isolation and the Soviet Union were able to export its revolution to Europe, and then all that fighting, all of that work, all of that toil, all of those losses in World War II would have been for nothing. And the United States had taken a leadership role in establishing the United Nations. The Berlin Airlift would be the impetus to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and also really kind of thrust the United States into this idea of confrontation with the Soviet Union, into starting this so-called Cold War. Now, the Cold War did have opponents on both sides. In the United States, there was a very famous couple called the Rosenbergs. They're pictured here after their arrest, who were very sympathetic to the Soviet Union and leery of the way in which the United States would conduct itself if it was the sole owner or the monopolistic power over atomic weaponry, that the United States could walk around like a gigantic bully. Now, is there evidence of that? Well, we see that, yes, the United States can act as a gigantic bully. Absolutely. That is true. We saw that in the shame of the United States in our lecture last week. There's also other evidences, but also rhetorically speaking, there were people who were not convinced that capitalism, and especially not neoliberalism, was the way of the future. Now, the Rosenbergs had been involved in the Manhattan Project, which was the project to develop atomic weapons. That was a joint venture between the United States, the Canadians, and the British government. And so the information that they were able to pass on, it actually seems like Julius, the man on the right, was probably the one who was doing most of the spying. Ethel, his wife on the left, may have been a patsy or an unwitting accomplice, or really didn't play that important a role. But the Rosenbergs were an integral part to getting a lot of research back to the Soviet Union. So what does that mean for the Soviet Union? Well, the U.S. believed that it had a monopoly on atomic weaponry, that the Soviet Union was working on atomic weaponry, but that it would take decades before the Soviet Union reached the level of sophistication that the United States had. So the United States felt like it had at least a couple of decades of breathing room. Well, in 1949, the atomic weapon, nicknamed First Lightning by the Soviet Union, nicknamed Joseph I by the United States, was detonated in Russia. And this begins an arms race, a nuclear arms race. Well, first an atomic arms race, and then later on a nuclear arms race. Atomic weapons measure their detonation in tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT. Nuclear weapons rate their detonation in the terms of millions of tons of TNT. So an order of 100 to 1,000 times more powerful. Just depends on which weapon they're comparing it to. So the United States and the Soviet Union, between 1949 and well into the 1970s and into the 1980s, are racing to build up nuclear weapons of differing types. There's all kinds of nuclear weapons that range from artillery, small artillery shells that would fire, a couple of miles away and detonate a relatively small atomic scale, tens of thousands of pounds of TNT, atomic weapon or to short range, medium range, intermediate range, and long range ballistic missiles, which would then detonate hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds of TNT. By 1980, between the Soviet Union and the United States, there are over 60,000 warheads. To give you an idea of how destructive that is, imagine that there's not just one Earth, but there's 7 or 8 Earths. You could detonate all of those weapons on those 7 or 8 Earths and wipe out all life on all those 7 or 8 Earths. That's how destructive it was. The reality, of course, is we only have one Earth, and so this arms race becomes ludicrous. It becomes crazy. I mean, at some point, the threat of so-called mutually assured destruction, that if the one power were to launch an attack on another power, the other power would retaliate with such overwhelming force that there would be no winner. We would not bomb each other back into the Stone Age. We'd bomb each other back into the pre-life on Earth age, before there were even protozoa and bacteria. So the problem with this mutually assured destruction in the Cold War, as a component of the Cold War, is illustrated perfectly in 1962. The Soviet Union was alarmed at the deploying of U.S. nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, the so-called Jupiter Medium Range Ballistic Missile, or MRBM, medium range. So it didn't have a lot of distance to go, so it could be detonated relatively quickly. They did tend to be a little bit lower in yield than the bigger bombs, but nonetheless very devastating. Now, the United States had been very keen to try to quash the expansion of communist regimes, and in 1961 had launched the Bay of Pigs, a disastrous attempted invasion that fell apart very quickly and consolidated power behind the communist government. There was a very fractious alliance up until 1961 between the communists of Cuba and other factions within Cuba. After the Bay of Pigs, all power is consolidated under Fidel Castro, and so it essentially, instead of unseating Castro, it made him stronger. Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier at the time, create this idea of maybe countering the United States in a way that it would not expect. For the Soviet Union, the deployment of atomic and nuclear weaponry in Cuba was a tit for tat for the deployment of nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. For Cuba, it was an assurance that the United States would never ever invade again, because if the United States stepped foot anywhere near Cuba, it would be able to launch atomic weaponry or nuclear weaponry, and that would obviously not be a good thing. So Cuba and the Soviet Union began building the secret arsenal in Cuba, and the United States was largely ignorant of what was happening. Why most of the missiles were actually disguised as palm trees. They put fake palm leaves on the tops of some of the missiles and some of the things. Some of the bases were disguised as other things, like construction projects and that sort of thing. Now, Cuba had this fear of invasion. The Soviet Union wanted this tit for tat escalation to push the United States into negotiating a settlement and saying, well, if you put missiles in Turkey, we can put missiles in Cuba. You put them in our backyard, we put them in your backyard. The United States is monitoring Cuba fairly regularly, especially after the 1961 invasion. It's not until 1962, in October of 1962, that luckily one particular spy plane catches a few suspected missile sites before they're disguised, before they're thoroughly disguised. The U-2 spy plane photos turn out to be a bombshell for the Kennedy administration, because it proves that there are nuclear weapons without the United States' knowledge a mere 90 miles from U.S. soil. They could start striking the Keys right away. They could hit as far north as the Carolinas. So this is a serious threat to the United States' security, and also the fact that, it's a surprise. So you're thinking, well, how bad could it possibly be? The president would just have to go on TV, say, hey, there's missiles here, we want them gone, and we're talking to the Soviet Union, right? No, that's not at all how it happened. There was no direct diplomatic lines between the White House and the Kremlin. There was no direct contact between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both were trying to pretend that the other didn't exist, because if you allow diplomats to discuss things between each other, maybe that might lead to a recognition that the other has a right to exist, that sort of thing. And so there was very little communication directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so because provocation is usually met with counter provocation, what we call brinksmanship, bringing people to the edge of war, the Cold War begins to get very, very warm. Largely, the Cold War ramps up because the responses were basically built in to ramp up any kind of confrontation. Rather than de-escalate, it's intended to escalate. So essentially, the world is on autopilot right towards the threshold of destruction. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union are both, strangely enough, keen not to have that happen, not to have all life on the planet wiped out. Well, the only problem is they can't talk to each other directly. There's no phone line. They can't just call up the White House, for example. So back-channel diplomacy begins to play out. France plays an integral part. Sweden plays an integral part. Even ABC News plays an integral part in ensuring that a diplomatic solution can be reached and that the clock doesn't run out on the human race. Now, what is at the heart of this confrontation? Well, publicly, the United States cannot allow a nuclear armed Cuba in its backyard. It doesn't recognize Cuba as a legitimate regime. It doesn't recognize Cuba's right to defend itself. It sees the atomic weapons as a useless provocation to war. And of course, you can't let the little guy push the big guy around. So there's a little bit of pride on there. The Soviet Union calls the United States blockade of Cuba piracy on international waters. So piracy is defined very clearly in international agreements. And so they're going to test the United States and say, if you board any of our Soviet ships, it'll be considered piracy. If you try to interdict our ships, it'll be considered piracy. And that's an act of war. And so rhetorically, publicly, both the United States and the Soviet Union are acting like two tough guys who don't really want to fight, but can't back down lest they be emasculated in front of their peers, basically. U.S. spy, things get really bad towards the end of these almost 2 weeks in October. A U.S. spy plane is shot down in Cuba, shocking the United States because the United States thought that the spy plane, which was flying so high and so fast, would never be reached by missiles produced by the Soviet Union. Surprise, surprise, Soviet Union did create a missile that was able to shoot down a U-2 plane. And so the shooting down of the U.S. spy plane ratchets tension up. The U.S. and Soviet begin to scramble air forces in the Pacific up by Alaska and the Bering Strait as U-2 planes begin to change their patterns and be recognized by Soviet radar. So now the United States' covert spying ability is really exposed. The Soviet Union scrambles fighter jets in order to protect that spy plane. The U.S. scrambles fighter jets. If a fighter jet gets shot down, guess what? It comes next. Escalation, right? A war between the Soviet Union and the United States. To make matters worse, the United States knows that there are Soviet submarines in the area and begins to discharge what are known as sounding depths. This is a term that you may not be familiar with if you've never served in the Navy. The sounding depths are small little charges that are dropped into the ocean, and when they go off at certain distances, it's made to create a sound shockwave that bounces off hard objects. and essentially find hidden submarines. They don't actually do any damage. They're actually about as destructive as a hand grenade. So the hand grenade's not really going to hurt the submarines that are down there, but it definitely exposes them. That being said, the Soviet submarines are under strict orders before they submerged that if they take any damage or detect any kind of aggression, either through depth charges or through surface fire, that they are to launch their nuclear-tipped torpedoes at the nearest target. We'd find this out in 2002 that actually the submarines had nuclear tipped torpedoes. Make it even worse, the United States thought that the missiles in Cuba were not ready to launch. The reality was, we found in 1997 that they were, in fact, ready to launch. And there were many in the Kennedy cabinet who said, screw negotiation, let's go ahead and invade. We will overwhelm them. We'll take these different bases, and the losses will be relatively low. The reality is, had they been allowed to go forward with the planned invasion, it would have triggered a nuclear war. Absolutely. Luckily, cooler heads prevail. In fact, when I was talking about that submarine, there was one particular officer who prevented a nuclear-tipped torpedo from being launched, and that was Vasily Arkhipov there, and he essentially saved the world. We say he's an officer. He was actually second in command on the submarine that was being detected, but he was actually the commander of the entire submarine flotilla that was in the area in the Gulf of Mexico at the time. And he was actually an admiral at the time, so he's a commodore. He was in command of all of these different ships, and he refused to comply with the orders because in order to launch this nuclear torpedo, it needed the assent of all three officers on board the submarine, and he was the one lone dissenting officer. When he gets back home, he and the other submariners get back home. They are derided and they're disgraced. They're vilified in the Soviet papers, saying it would have been better if they had gone down with the ship, if they had launched the torpedo and at least gotten the American nose bloodied and that sort of thing. And that kind of bravado is played out in a lot of different ways in both the Soviet Union and the United States. Luckily, cooler heads do prevail. So what do I mean? What do I mean? How close were we? Well, theoretically, if in 1962 the United States and the Soviet Union had gone to war, it would have taken about 90 minutes for the majority of both the United States and Soviet arsenal to scramble. So 90 minutes, an hour and a half. Within the first wave of attacks, about a third of the world population would have died instantly. Within 90 minutes, one third of the world would be dead. And most of the deaths would be in Europe, Asia, and North America. The exchanges probably would have continued with the rest of the world either dying by direct blast, those are the lucky ones, or those who survive would have had to deal with radiation sickness or a nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is when a lot of dust particles get caught up in the atmosphere. They're charged with nuclear radiation. They tend to congregate and create a massive cloud cover. This nuclear winter would last for years. So that whole fantasy of, oh, I'll just live underground with my canned beans and dry rice for 6 months. Well, good luck on that one. The fallout would block the sun. Plants would die because they can't photosynthesize. Animals would then die shortly thereafter. The earth would have a lot less oxygen, a lot more radiation. So even if you survived with your beans and rice and canned cream corn or whatever, when you come out, eventually you would have to come out. You would be radiated. You would suffer the effects of long-term radiation sickness and mutations. So luckily, this did not happen. Now let's push forward a little bit. Let's fast forward a little bit to the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is both a case of the Cold War and also a case of anti-colonialism. Unlike the other two before, this is kind of our hybrid case. Now, Vietnam, which was called Indochine by the French colonizers who first established an empire in the mid 19th century, had been administering, well, quote unquote, air quote, administering Southeast Asia for about 80 some odd years, when in 1945, the uh, Japanese military dislodged the French Vichy regime from Southeast Asia. Why? Well, the Vichy regime was working counter to the Japanese interests, was often doing things that were upsetting to the Japanese, and plus they wanted to get the French out of Southeast Asia. They needed Vietnam. The Japanese were not terribly interested in administering Vietnam, but as long as the French were gone, that's all that mattered. Now, spearheading one of the groups that was fighting against the Japanese was a resistance fighter named Ho Chi Minh, who received lots of American money to continue the fight. And eventually, when Japan quits Vietnam or Southeast Asia in 1945, shortly before its surrender in World War II, the North Vietnamese, which are led by Ho Chi Minh, which are largely communist, declare victory. They declare that Vietnam is now independent from France. France is not so keen to let it go, and does launch a war to retain that Southeast Asian territory, a war that does not go very well over the course of 9 years. One of the settlements that was agreed to was a UN brokered referendum, a national referendum that would reunify the northern communist and the southern non-communist parts of the country. That referendum came and went. It was largely ignored by the United States, France, Great Britain, and other anti-communist allies because the northern Vietnamese communist regime won overwhelmingly. Uh, so the war against France continued, ground on, and even though France quits Vietnam in 1954, the United States can't quite say no, and so the United States takes over in place of the French in Vietnam. Now, for the roots of this particular conflict are very complex, but to boil it down to some major points, France had been rebelled against successfully, and it was an anti-colonial movement. France leaves in 1954. Theoretically, they've been defeated. Vietnam should have its independence. The UN had promised a referendum. The Northern Communist regime was extremely popular, so we would like to have an entirely communist country. The Southern anti-communist regime, and I put anti-communist here with a little asterisk there, they were really more of a dictatorial regime. They were very right-wing, very ultra-conservative. They were just anybody who was an opponent to the regime was labeled a communist, and they could be disappeared, summarily executed, politically imprisoned, you name it. So the Southern anti-communist regime is extremely unpopular, even in the South. So and then on top of it, even when the French were there, even when the government in South Korea wasn't as strongman as it eventually came to be, it was horribly misgoverned. It was rife with corruption. It was abusive, totalitarian regime. It was very harsh regime. To the United States, Ho Chi Minh wasn't a freedom fighter anymore. He had become a Soviet stooge. Why? Because he was receiving funding, he was receiving arms and training from China, from China and from the Soviet Union. And so the United States begins pouring money in 1955 to support the South Vietnamese government. Well, that's going poorly because, as I mentioned before, the government's not very popular, so they're having a hard time fighting this war. The United States sends advisors in the late 1950s, special forces, what would later become the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, that sort of thing. And then actual troops begin to show up, actual main line troops, infantry, cavalry, you name it, begin to show up in 1962, and they remain until 1973. Now, the South Vietnamese government kind of remains in place until 1975 when it's finally solidified under communist rule. To the Soviet Union, Vietnam is the perfect test case proxy to spread the revolution. And success in Vietnam could theoretically cause what is known as a domino effect in international circles. That if Vietnam falls to communism, so then Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and other nations in Southeast Asia would then fall to communism, and this would allow it to export further and further, kind of breaching that containment that the United States had been trying to practice for a long time. China contributed a lot of money, a lot of troops, a lot of training, and a lot of weaponry as well. And China was seen, at least in part, as an important partner. Now, here's the irony. Once the United States leaves the Vietnam, and once Vietnam has its own government in 1975, almost immediately China begins to try to exert influence over Vietnam. Vietnam says, no thanks, we don't want the influence. So China invades, and Vietnam fights another war. So they fought against many large powers. They fought against the Japanese until 1945. They fought against the French until 1954. They fought against the Americans until 1973, and they fight against the Chinese until 1979, when the Chinese eventually are handed a very decisive loss and quit the field and leave Vietnam alone. Vietnam also, if you've ever heard of the killing fields of Cambodia, Vietnam is the one that topples the communist regime in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, if you will. And it's the Vietnamese who go in and invade and topple that regime and allow for a kind of military dictatorship that takes over. So Vietnam becomes a very unusual country, beholden to really none, and actually the United States and Vietnam are now incredibly close trading partners, even though Vietnam is a largely communist country. Now, this war in Vietnam lasts for about 19 years, roughly. Now, the United States during that time had a lot of different, sometimes contradictory goals, with the very vague end goal of quote unquote defeating communism. That's very, very vague. It's very difficult. That's like saying, defeating Barney songs, that sort of thing. You're not really going to defeat those things, or defeating children's songs, right? You're not going to defeat an idea. You have to have concrete goals. So very quickly, the war bogs down, and these contradictory goals, these contradictory directives from different presidents, whether it's John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, or Richard Nixon, lead to the feeling that we're fighting a pointless war. This leads to atrocities on both sides. That as the war grinds on, the cooler heads don't prevail. This leads to American troops committing atrocities. It leads to Vietnamese troops committing atrocities. Leads to so-called carpet bombing. The amazing fact is that in the Vietnam War, more ordnance was dropped than in all of World War II by both sides. And this is Vietnam. It's just a tiny little country. It also begins to blur the lines of the conflict. It's not kept within the borders of Vietnam, but also includes Cambodia and Laos and others as well. It leads to a lot of confusion in both the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, and eventually the American public gets tired enough of it that the United States withdraws from Vietnam in 1973. So U.S.-led assistance of colonial powers undercuts this kind of rhetoric of freedom in the Cold War. Is it enough to be anti-communist to be considered free? Are you still free if you're living under a dictatorial regime that is ultra right wing, that disappears people, that summarily executes people, that has a secret police? Are you still free? The Soviet Union and its allies are interested in aiding states that will eventually fall under its sway. It's not interested in helping those communist regimes who want to chart an independent path. It's not enough to be rhetorically communist, you have to be Soviet communist. So is it enough to be anti-West to be free? Neither side, neither the US nor the Soviet Union, are really interested in what the local people want in any way, shape, or form. So the upshot of the Cold War is that things seem to make sense on a map and from a PR and from a rhetorical perspective. In the West, you're fighting for freedom, capitalism, neoliberalism, integrated economy. The Soviet Union, you seem to be fighting against oppression. You seem to be fighting against neo-colonialism. You seem to be fighting against the economic exploitation of people. All the while, the United States and the Soviet Union are building up a nuclear arsenal and rely upon this idea of mutually assured destruction. But what if? What if, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, something else happens and brings us to the brink? What happens then? What if cooler heads don't really prevail? What if that one officer decides that, yes, they will launch that nuclear-tipped torpedo? Or another officer decides, yes, I will launch a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union. What's the point of having all these weapons, all these toys if we can't use them? The Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular, exposes how preposterous this arms race is. And in the plot of Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, that is exactly what happens. A rogue Air Force general sends his bombers out with mission to bomb the Soviet Union and provoke World War III. And although he is portrayed as a crazy man, he doesn't really sway too far away from a lot of the rhetoric that was actually circulating in the Pentagon. That what's the point of having these weapons if you're not going to use them? Eventually, the Ruskies are going to launch, so we might as well beat them to the punch, that kind of thing. Vietnam and, of course, its cousin Afghanistan wars expose that wars by proxy are not only useless, but that they're deadly. That just because somebody is the enemy of my enemy does not necessarily mean later on down the road that they will be your friend. A good example of that is Ho Chi Minh was backed by the United States until he wasn't. Another good example was Saddam Hussein, who was backed by the United States until he wasn't. Another good example is Osama bin Laden, who was backed by the United States until, yep, you guessed it, he suddenly wasn't. So there was a need to climb down from this escalating arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union begin talking to each other in earnest in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And they come to several very important agreements. First is the limitation of strategic arms or nuclear arsenal, and this is the treaty known as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And then once you put a limit on that, okay, we're not going to build any more new ones. We're just going to maintain the ones that we have or replace the ones that are obsolete with new ones. There's not going to be more bombs added. Well, once you've gotten to that baseline, that one little line that you're going to operate from, then you can begin reducing your arms. And so we get these START discussions, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. Moreover, the United States and the Soviet Union agree to anti-proliferation, that if other actors, if other countries who are irresponsible get a hold of these weapons, they could use them irresponsibly. Although it's an imperfect agreement because India, Pakistan, France, Israel, the United Kingdom, they all developed their own nuclear arsenals. There was one nuclear power that developed its nuclear power and then gave it up voluntarily, and that was South Africa. South Africa developed its own nuclear weapons and decided I didn't want to be part of this club anymore, and a few decades later, voluntarily dismantled unilaterally all of its weapons. No pressure from the outside world. So it is possible to climb down from this. It is not necessarily important to a country to have these nuclear arms. It's just not necessary. So why would either the United States or the Soviet Union or both want to voluntarily disarm? Isn't the whole point of building up these weapons, isn't it all for nothing? Why would the Soviet Union or the United States want to prevent the proliferation of nuclear arms? And why should the United States and now Russia, former Soviet Union, be vigilant against resuming the arms race? Why would we want to prevent the arms race from picking back up again? It's important questions. Now we're going to move on to something else. We're going to talk about anti-colonialism. And in the rhetoric of the day, from the 1940s up until about the 1980s, there was this very clear theoretical division, at least in the eyes of many pundits and politicians on both sides of this divide. And that was that there were two worlds. To the United States, we were the leader of the first world, or the free world. And to the Soviet Union, they were the leader of their own truly free world, what the United States referred to as the second world. So we have first world and second world, right? But there's a lot of parts of the world that are left out. And a lot of parts of the world that were not happy with being aligned with either one or the other. And so in the 1940s and 50s, there emerged a so-called third way, the non-aligned movement. And as you can see, it's mostly former colonial holdings, most of it in Africa, most of it in Asia, some South Americans as well. But also China begins to join, and Mongolia and parts of Southeast Asia, and even Eastern Europe. These formerly colonized nations, mostly, were wary of dealing with the superpowers. They were wary of dealing with the superpowers on the superpowers' own terms. By being aligned in this kind of third way movement, the non-aligned movement, or the Association of Non-Aligned States, they could possibly play one side against the other and get the better deal. If you could only buy food from one supermarket, if you could only buy a car from one dealership, if you could only buy a house from one real estate agent, do you have a lot of bargaining power? If you have competition, at least in the capitalist mindset, if you have competition, there is an impetus for both sides to try to win that customer, to beat out the other side. And that's true in international politics as well. And part of this third line movement was these former colonial states. And they played an important part because they had experienced trying to deal with one party unilaterally, the small guy against the big guy. And so we're going to look at a couple of case studies. There was a history of trying to integrate Algeria into France, into French proper, being considered part of France, stretching all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had conquered Algeria as part of his expansion into creating a new Frankish empire, and that had been done in the early 19th century. And ever since then, the Euro-French administrators had created this artificial division within Algeria between the colonists and the natives. So on one level, they said that that Algeria was part of France, much like the province of Normandy or Auvergne or Dijon or Champagne are all parts of France. Algeria is just another region. So rhetorically, they say that. But in reality, the French colonists or colons were given a lot more political and economic rights and access. The natives, the people who had been born there, who been uh, had been there for generations, were relegated to a second tier. And within that second tier, there were divisions that were sown by the French government, that classic divide and rule, to set the natives against each other so that it was easier because they were distracted. There was also rampant military oppression for the about 100 years between 1840s and the 1960s. Um, and this leads to at least in the post-World War II environment, a guerrilla type rebellion, that asymmetrical rebellion. Now, this asymmetrical rebellion actually starts taking place in the 1920s and 30s, is continued under the Vichy regime in the 1940s, that um, pseudo-French regime that was propped up by the Nazis, or the Nazi regime. And it continued as the Republic takes back control. So in the eyes of many of these Algerians, a Frenchman is always a Frenchman. It doesn't matter what way they salute or what flag they salute. France technically wins the Algerian War in the 1960s through the use of very brutal military oppression, widespread use of torture. They use sweeps, which are essentially if a crime is committed within a region, they lock down the entire, let's say, neighborhood, and they go door to door looking for the criminals, making sure that they don't get away. So if there was let's say, a shooting at a cafe on the street corner, within a 10-block radius of that street corner, they locked down that entire 10 city block, and they went door to door with military, bursting in doors, no warrants, no due process, no so as you please or knock on the door or anything like that. They also incarcerated people that they suspected of being sympathetic to the rebels. This had the unintended side effect of making people more sympathetic to the rebels, because if you're breaking down my door and beating up my husband and taking my son off and putting him in jail, I'm not going to be terribly sympathetic to you, dear Frenchman. Later on, however, in 1962, France does eventually cede their claim to Algeria and leaves Algeria in 1962. But the damage is done. Those divisions that had been sown in Algerian society, the people that were favored, who were largely called Francophiles or Francophones, those who could speak French fluently, were often targeted by radicals. And radicals also targeted moderates, people who were maybe not as keen on, say, a socialist revolution or a fundamentalist Muslim revolution or a Western style autocracy or anything like that. So you had these multiple different factions that were fighting against each other, and it lasts well into the 1990s. It was only settled down in the early 2000s, but then was picked up again during the Arab Spring of the 2010s. Algeria is still kind of a very touchy state even now. A lot of those social divisions are simmering just below the surface. A second case study, we've kind of touched on this last time when we talked about India, when the British occupation of India had extended for about 150 years, really began in the early 1800s, consolidating that empire, direct colonial rule in 1857. And there was a division within India between those who were considered English and those who were considered Indians. So there was a multi-tiered society. There's also a policy of divide and rule. In this case, it was Muslim against Hindu. There's also other religious sects within India that are largely ignored that also fall victim. For example, Hindu nationalists attack Muslims this last year in 2019, 2020, have been attacking them throughout India without the Indian government's response. The Indian government's quite happy to let that sectarian violence play out, but those Hindus also attack Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Sikhs and you name it. So they attack anybody who is not like them, and that's largely a an exacerbation of some of the divisions within India. India was never really um, a united empire under one particular religious or ethnic rule, the way China was. So there is a lot of that long-standing animosity between communities that was exacerbated under British rule. There was also, of course, as we talked about before, military oppression in the 1920s and 1930s and going all the way into the 1940s. The Satyagraha movement, there's a term that from a previous lecture. Do you remember it? Satyagraha. Okay, so the Satyagraha resistance demoralized the British. And the upshot is that Britain's attempts to regain control over India in the years following World War II really lack the political desire. There's really an exhaustion on the part of the British that is really not present as much in the French, partly because of the depletion of World War II, but also partly because of the PR pressure that is being put forward by the home rule movement in international circles. Remember, I told you about Gandhi utilizing the power of the media to pressure Britain in, and there were many who were sympathetic to the independence movement within Britain as well. So Britain just acknowledges reality and leaves peaceably in 1947 with half-hearted attempts to try to reconcile the two major religious factions within India of Islam and Hinduism, but it eventually winds up dividing India into multiple parts. So there's a division between Pakistan and India. Britain still maintains ties to both culturally, linguistically, and economically. One of the great sports fevers in India and Pakistan is the Cricket World Cup, something that Americans will never really understand, I suppose, but is it wildly popular in India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan remain bitter enemies over the past 70 some odd years. They've been in 4 straight up wars. It is important to note that they're both now nuclear powers, and they both have nuclear arsenals that they are more than willing to use if push comes to shove. And right now, the province of Kashmir seems to be a hotly contested spot between India and Pakistan. There's also a decolonization movement in the United States. I know it seems weird, right? But unlike other colonial movements where foreigners came in and took over a country, in the United States, it was foreigners were brought in as a subservient class within the United States. So in many ways, there is very much a similar architecture in the United States that there is in foreign countries when you have colonial presence. African Americans were nominally freed in 1865, at least according to the Constitution. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment should have allowed them to be free. The reality was there was division between the political rights and the political realities, especially in the South, but not contained only in the South. The division between African Americans and non-African Americans was driven largely by ignorance and decades old racist attitudes and hatreds. A good example of this is the Jim Crow laws that prevented blacks and whites from going to the same school, from sitting in the same section of the bus, from drinking from the same water fountain, using the same bathroom, on and on and on and on and on. And in order to ensure the that African Americans maintained their quote place within American society, there was widespread use of domestic terror. Now, it's important to note that although we do focus in the civil rights movement and the civil rights education on southern states, that was just the more extreme of the two versions. There was a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, a lot of segregation that was happening in northern states, in so-called liberal states, places like New York and California and Chicago, Detroit, and in large cities and small cities, rural and urban alike, north and south alike. It was just more extreme in the South. The civil rights movements, and I put an put a asterisk there because there were multiple different civil rights movements, all with different goals, some of which ranged from uh, racial separatism, this black nationalist movement that would see a parallel but still present black community that was independent of white governance and community, so a divided within itself state, all the way to true racial integration, which the most famous face of that would be Martin Luther King. They borrow a lot of the resistances from India and other places as well. Most famously, Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach seems to garner the most affection now. It is important to note, however, that in the 1950s, in the 1960s, up until his assassination, Martin Luther King was one of the most unpopular people amongst white people because he was creating problems, because he was creating discord and pointing out issues that needed to be pointed out. Segregationist movements borrow a lot from white supremacists. They talk about the inherent inferiority of black people. They talk about the racial proclivity towards violence and instability, and that continues well into the 1980s, well into the 1990s, well into the 2000s, well into the 2010s, and even now in the 2020s. There is still that rhetorical use of black people as the scary individual, as the poorly educated individual, as the lazy individual, as the criminal, and that sort of thing. We can see that played out with incarceration numbers, conviction rates, education funding, and on and on and on. So what happens, unlike Algeria, unlike India, unlike Vietnam, there is an incomplete, what I would call an interdependence, a need to move forward as a whole country. The divide and rule is still very, very much alive in American culture. Absolutely. And there's a difference between laws which are passed and the culture which persists. A good example of this would be the law that was passed that integrated schools in the 1950s in the Brown v. Board of Education, and the culture which motivated some hateful individuals to heckle school-age children, to threaten them with death, to threaten them with rape, to threaten their family, to threaten the police officers who were escorting them, to force the federal government to send the National Guard in to safeguard children in a school from adults who should grow the hell up and realize that desegregation isn't a bad thing, or that even affirmative action, although often gets a kind of bad rap, like somebody doesn't deserve to be here or doesn't deserve to be there. It is an artificial quota. It is a very clunky system. It can be a very inefficient system and unfair system, but unfortunately, it leads to those thinking that the struggle for interdependence, for integration as a nation, as a body politic, as a social network, as a society, is over and done with. That those things happen in the past. The laws are passed. Now it's all done. The laws passing are not over and done. You have to also tackle the culture. And at the heart of it is economic issues. And towards the end of the civil rights era in the 1960s, before it really kind of started being disintegrated and ignored in the mainstream media, at the root of it is economic issues. That race, quote unquote race, to borrow to paraphrase Martin Luther King, race is window dressing. It is not the real thing. It is economic inequality. That a man cannot be free, truly free, if he is dependent upon his employer, if he is dependent upon his worth being tied to what job he works. We see that today with essential workers in supermarkets, with essential workers at hospitals, with essential workers at clinics, with essential workers at warehouses, post office, delivery drivers, you name it. They are often the lowest paid people. And those who are not essential workers are usually the ones who are paid much better. And that is the heart of what Martin Luther King was saying was the window dressing of race. It is largely an indictment of neoliberalism that capitalism without bounds does have an impact on society. It continues to have an impact throughout these decades. It is not just Martin Luther King. It is not just Colin Kaepernick, but it is the culture. What is right? What do we identify ourselves as? But the reality is that economic issues can and do affect everybody. They affect them directly, and they also affect them indirectly. So upon review, and here we are at the end, only an hour and a half, not like last time. So rhetorically, the United States and its allies speak of freedom, but suppress their own people. Why was it important to suppress communist and socialist voices within the United States, within Canada, within Nicaragua, within Britain, within France, within the so-called First World? Rhetorically, the Soviet Union also spoke of countering oppression, but also brutally suppressed their own people, whether it was Stalin's pogroms that killed tens of thousands of people, leading to millions of people dying under his government, although it was all internally. His numbers exceed those of Adolf Hitler. If it's Mao Zedong and his Cultural Revolution that led to the death of millions and millions of people that exceeded even Joseph Stalin's numbers. So they brutally oppress their people, but they talk about countering oppression. Why? The anti-colonial movements also occasionally required violence, or at least the defiance of laws. Why was that an important part of their independence, or in some cases, interdependence? All right, guys, that is some really meaty questions. Don't worry if you don't have answers to these. They are something we need to wrestle with as a society, but historians and political scientists and philosophers have been wrestling with this for a very, very long time. And some of the best and brightest minds can't even agree on it. All right, guys, that is it for this week. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again for next week, which is the final week, week 16. We're almost there. We're almost done. I want you to stay safe, wash your hands, okay?